I used to live and work in central London. I was a financial trader. It was a high-stakes environment. I knew of people who were millionaires by the time that they were 35, and others who were burnt out by the same age. I had eyes only for the riches. I was young, single, and in perpetual motion. I was rising before dawn to spend time in the gym, before working 12 hours straight through. And then I would hit the bars and clubs and fall into bed after midnight. Not long after my 26th birthday, I had a nervous breakdown. After 4 days at home taking the medication that I had been prescribed and hating how it made me feel, I threw all my tablets away and went back to work. Or at least I tried to. I had a panic attack on the train and didn't even make it into the office. I ended up running out of the station and went to sit in a small square. There were a couple of wooden benches and a patch of overgrown grass. Tall buildings rose all around me. I was struggling to breathe and my face was wet with tears, and I knew that I needed to make a change. So, a few weeks later, I moved to Cornwall. I had never been to Cornwall before. I decided to move there based on an internet search. And then I found an old fisherman's cottage to rent in a small village. Call it following my heart and call it a gut instinct. I did not worry about the details along the way. I just did it. I had a decent amount of money saved up and I did not need to earn anything for 6 months while I reset my life. I saw myself going for long, windswept walks by the sea, cooking hearty meals in the evening, and starting my own business, something artistic, where I could work with my hands and connect with nature. It was going to be perfect. My journey from London to Cornwall was made by train and then a long taxi journey. The taxi driver pulled over before we got to the village and mumbled something about the road and not being suitable. I wasn't happy about this, but I was too tired from the journey to argue, and I could see a weather-beaten sign on a wooden post, which said that the village was only a half-mile away. So I climbed out and retrieved my suitcases from the back of the taxi. I was tempted to give the driver the finger as he drove away, but I counted to 10 instead and set off in the direction of the village. In fairness to the driver, the road wasn't suitable for driving. It was narrow and it was soon untarmacked and then running steeply downhill. Grass banks rose on either side and I couldn't see where it was heading. I plowed on and was starting to wonder if I had gone the wrong way when the road had leveled out and a few paces later, I had emerged onto a pebble beach. The view that I was presented with was wonderful. Beyond the beach, the sea reached out to a distant horizon. There wasn't a ship in sight to break the majestic spell of the ocean. A few feet away from where I stood, waves lapped gently onto the beach. It was so peaceful. The crowds and stress of London seemed like they belonged to another world. I took a deep breath and started to walk down the beach. I imagined how the small stones I could feel underfoot had formed over thousands of years, steadily being worn away and carried into place. Ahead of me, rows of cottages looked out over the sea. One of them was my new home. As I approached the cottages, I knew that coming to live here had been the right thing to do. The cottages looked like something from a postcard, like something from another age. Their whitewashed stone walls were pitted and worn, but looked resilient, and they were huddled closely together. In London, I had a small circle of friends, all of whom were connected to my work in one way or another, and all of whom had drifted away rapidly when I became sick. I had not known any of my neighbors. Taken in my new surroundings, I had the feeling that I would get to know my neighbors in the village soon, and that would be a good thing. It would mean that I was a part of a community, not just one more stranger in an uncaring city. The agency that I was letting the cottage from had posted the keys to me in London. I unlocked the door and then had to bend down to walk through without banging my head on top of the frame. The cottage was dark inside and cold. There was a strong smell of damp as well. This wasn't good. But the agency had told me the property had been empty for a while, so it wasn't entirely unexpected. I figured that after I had been there for a few days and had aired the place out, it would be fine. I carried my suitcase through to the front room. There was a sofa facing a window which looked out at the sea. I sat down. I would unpack in a moment. I just needed a rest first. It had been a long day after an incredibly difficult time in my life. I looked at the waves rising and falling, and my eyes started to feel heavy. The next thing I knew, I was blinking and looking at the light of a new day streaming in through the window. I was a bit stiff, but other than that, I felt totally refreshed. It was the best night's sleep that I had had in years. I checked my watch. If I would still be in London, I would have already gone to the gym and spent hours staring at figures on a screen. As it was, I was free to take my time as I made coffee and then had a long shower. The water rattled rather alarmingly in the pipes, but it was nice and hot, and the pressure was good, so I had no complaints. I unpacked a change of clothes and decided to sort the rest of my things out later. I wanted to get out and about and explore the village and start meeting my neighbors. It was a bright and clear day. I was struck again by how quiet it was. There were no cars on the road, no music blaring out or sirens. But then something squawked overhead. I looked up and saw a seagull circling. I waved in its direction and called out, "Hey, how's it going?" I thought that I was alone, but then I realized that I wasn't. An old man was standing in the open doorway of one of the cottages. He was looking at me with a disapproving expression on his face. I felt my cheeks redden, and I was about to tell him that I didn't usually talk to the wildlife, when he retreated into his cottage and closed the door. I sighed. That was not the ideal start to me getting to know my neighbors, but things would get better, I told myself, and I set off walking. No one else seemed to be out and about, though I could see smoke rising from the chimneys of some of the cottages. I headed along the beach. The sea was further out, and I thought about how I would get to know the times of high and low tides as a part of my new life, and I felt a warm glow inside. I was beyond the cottages now, following the sweep of the beach, when I noticed someone standing on the beach. It was a young woman dressed in a raincoat that looked too big for her, a woolly hat and boots. Strands of curly dark hair stuck out from under the sides of her hat. She was staring out to sea and seemed to have not noticed me. Part of me thought that it would be best to leave her alone with her thoughts, but I decided to say hello, not just because she was one of my new neighbors, but because I also thought that she was very attractive. Wishing that I had paid more attention to my appearance before leaving my cottage, I went over to her. "Good morning," I said brightly. She turned slowly to face me, and my heart sank. There were tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry," I mumbled. I didn't mean to intrude." "Oh, that's okay," she replied. "I was thinking." I wanted to say something insightful, then maybe she would smile, and then I could say something funny to make her laugh, and this whole situation would no longer be painfully uncomfortable. The only problem with this plan was that I couldn't think of a single thing to say. Instead, I looked at her and then at my shoes, while she brushed a strand of her hair away from her face. Well, I best be getting on, she said finally and set off walking back in the direction of the cottages. Sounds good. I'll see you around, I called after her, which immediately felt like a stupid thing to say. If I kept this up, I figured, every single person in the village would think that I was an idiot before the week was out. Feeling deflated, I made my way slowly home and sat on the sofa looking at the sea. Before long, my stomach had started to rumble. I checked the time. It was after midday and I was famished. I had packed 4 cans of soup along with socks, t-shirts, a toothbrush, and the rest of the basics that I would need for the first few days. And I dug one of the cans out of the suitcase. There was a cooker in the cottage and I was in need of a good clean, but it seemed to work okay. Now, I just needed to find a can opener. I hadn't brought one with me and couldn't find one after rooting through all the drawers in the kitchen. Not a problem, I thought. I could knock on a neighbor's door and ask to borrow a can opener, and I could do this without making a fool of myself. Surely. I took a deep breath and I went for it. The cottage next door did not have a doorbell that I could see, or a knocker, so I tapped on the door with my knuckles. I was relieved when it opened a moment later. The lady who had answered the door seemed familiar, which made no sense to me, until she tucked a strand of her dark curly hair behind her ear and I had a eureka moment. "Hi," I said. "I think I met your daughter earlier." And then I bit my lip, wondering if once again I was being stupid. What if the woman that I had seen on the beach was not this lady's daughter? She could have been a younger sister or have no relation at all. Thankfully, the lady in the doorway smiled and said, "Ah, yeah, Jane mentioned that she had met a young man earlier, and I was wondering if it was our new neighbor. Please, come in." I had a relieved smile on my face as I stepped inside. The cottage was warm and cozy. There were trinkets and picture frames on a mantelpiece over a fireplace, a big old-fashioned clock on the wall, a bookcase crammed to the brim with paperbacks and hardbacks and magazines, and a matching sofa and chairs which looked like you could just sink into them and be wonderfully comfortable. There was also a small table in front of one of the chairs which had a glass on it. The glass was half full, with what looked to me like whiskey. It struck me as a bit early for drinking strong liquor, and I realized that I was staring at the glass when the lady said, "How are you settling in?" She sounded and looked a bit embarrassed, and I once again felt like I was making a mess of things, which made me overcompensate when I replied, far too cheerfully and loudly, "Great, really good, thank you. In fact, the only thing missing from my life at the moment is a can opener." All credit to her for not wincing. Instead, she said, "Well, you are very welcome to borrow one. I'll be back in a minute." When she was out of the room, I kicked myself, literally jabbed the toes of one foot into the side of my other foot. It hurt, I winced, and I felt like I deserved it. The lady returned, brandishing a can opener. "Oh, here you go," she said. I thanked her and I should have left it at that. But between the lunchtime whiskey at home and her daughter's tears earlier on the beach, I figured that something was wrong and I wanted to reach out. I stood there, holding the can opener, and swallowed as I got my courage up and then said, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but I was wondering if you and your daughter are all right." At my question, her bright facade dimmed. Her shoulders slumped slightly and a sad smile appeared on her face. "Would you like a drink?" she asked. I said I would because it felt like the right thing to do. She topped up her own glass and poured a generous measure for me. I settled onto the sofa and took a sip. I spluttered and said thank you in a hoarse voice. This was not bargain shop whiskey. It was the real deal. Holding her glass, she walked over to the mantelpiece, picked up a framed photograph and brought it over to me. It showed a small group of men gathered around in front of a boat. "That's the crew of the Marlin," she told me. "All local men, all fishermen. The man in the center with the daft grin and beard is my husband." Her voice faltered and then she continued. "Was my husband. Was Jane's father. 10 years ago, the Marlin went down off the coast and all on board were drowned. Jane was 12 years old. She was devastated. I mean, we all were. Tomorrow was the anniversary of the accident. It's hard, so very hard." Once more her voice trailed off, but this time, she simply looked into her glass and not taking a drink, just gazing at the amber liquid. "I'm so sorry," I said, and then quickly sipped my drink because once again, I couldn't find any words that could possibly fit. When my glass was empty, I promised that I would bring the can opener back later, and then I saw myself out. I wasn't much of a drinker, especially not in the day and on an empty stomach, and the whiskey had clearly hit me hard because I couldn't find my key and I didn't understand why. I didn't have that many pockets and it had to be in one of them. I was still fumbling in my pockets when I noticed the old man was back in his open doorway. He was looking at me and was apparently still not impressed. I took a deep breath. If this had been London, I would have blanked him or asked him what his problem was. But this was the village, I reminded myself. The small place where I wanted so much to fit in. "Good afternoon," I said to him, and had the awful feeling that I was slurring my words. But I kept going. "I'm new here. It's lovely to meet you." He didn't break into a smile or say how pleased he was to meet me, but I plowed on. "I've just been talking to the lady next door. She told me about her husband and the other men. It's awful, especially in such a small community where everybody must know each other." The old man's face twisted into a sneer. "They were fools," he said. His voice was low and harsh, a smoker's growl. "Fools and dead because of it. I warned them, told them not to take the boat out when there was a mist coming, but they didn't listen to me." And then he stepped back inside and closed the door. I was shocked and confused, and I really needed to go to the bathroom. Still unable to find the key, I tried the door handle. It turned and I lurched inside. I had unlocked the door and the key was still on the table. What an idiot, I thought, and I stumbled towards the bathroom. The rest of the day was a write-off. I managed to make some soup and then I fell asleep on the sofa. I woke up feeling disturbed from dreams that I immediately forgot, but I didn't have the will to drag myself to bed, so I closed my eyes and dropped back into sleep. At some point I woke up briefly again. The room was in darkness, and I couldn't see the ocean through the window. Everything was obscured by a grayness that was drifting past my vision. Sometime around dawn, I finally roused myself and went to stand in the shower until the hot water ran out. I opened another can of soup for breakfast, because I didn't have anything else then, and decided that it was time to get organized. I made a to-do list. First item was to stock up on food. There didn't seem to be any shops in the village though. I would have to shop online and hope there would be a local supplier who could deliver to my doorstep despite the state of the road. I turned on my laptop and my phone. I already knew that there was no internet connection in the cottage, so I was going to use my phone as a hotspot until I made a better arrangement. Which it would have been fine if my phone had been showing any bars. I walked all around the cottage and there was still no signal, so I went to stand in the street. Still nothing. I swore to myself. Being in the middle of nowhere was peaceful and scenic, but being cut off like this was so infuriating. I swore out loud at a circling seagull, and did not care what anybody thought about that. And then I went to ask the lady next door where she got her shopping from. When she opened the door, I could tell straight away that something was wrong. She looked very pale and close to tears. I forgot about shopping and I asked her what had happened. "It's Jane," she replied in a shaky voice. "I thought she was in her room, but when she didn't get up this morning, I went in and her bed hadn't been slept in. There was a sea mist last night and I think she was out in it. I'm so worried about her." At the best of times, this would have been concerning, but today was the anniversary of her father's death at sea, alongside the other crew members. This was clearly something that she had been struggling with. "It's going to be okay," I said. "I'll go look for her. I'm sure she won't have gone far." In my heart, I did not know if this was true, but I wanted to appear strong and calm and do everything that I could to help. Resisting the urge to run, I set off along the beach, heading to where I had last seen Jane. But the beach was deserted. I kept going. I walked for miles and there was no sign of her, hoping that maybe she had turned up back at home by now, or that she was being confronted by a neighbor. I turned around and walked back towards the village. I was in sight of the cottages when I saw something in the sea. It was moving in the tide, close to the edge of the beach. I ran forward into the water, not thinking about getting wet, and I leaned over and picked up the thing that I had seen. It was a woolen hat. Jane's. I held the hat and I looked out over the sea. There was nothing else there. Where before I had seen beauty, now all I saw was a bleak emptiness. Had Jane walked out into this vast expanse on purpose? Or had she lost away in the mist and fallen and been swept away? I had no proof that anything dreadful had happened, other than that the hat in my hand in her absence, but these were enough. I knew in my guts that she was gone, drowned like her father and the rest of the crew on that tragic vessel 10 years ago. I wiped at a tear with my hand and turned away from the cold, cruel sea and went to see Jane's mother. Before I made it to her cottage, I saw the old man who thought so little of me. He was walking towards me along the beach. His movements were slow and laborious. He looked exhausted and his eyes were bloodshot. I could see that clearly as he came closer. "Do you know," I asked, "about Jane?" "Yes," he said in a ragged voice. "Their mother told me. She went out into the mist and now..." He began to add, but I interrupted him. "And now what?" I shouted, suddenly furious. "You told me that you knew there was a mist coming. You could have warned everybody not to go out last night, not to take the risk." He wouldn't look me in the eye when he replied. "No one would have listened, especially not Jane, the way that she was hurting." "Well, you could have tried." I screamed in his face. I had lost control. He flinched, almost as if I had physically struck him, and then said quietly, I should have tried, but I didn't. I gave up and wrapped myself in the bitterness that is all I've known these last 10 years. Finally, he looked at me, and I could see the pain in his eyes when he said, "Knowing is not a gift, it is a curse." My anger with him was spent, and now I felt only pity. "It's too late now," I said. "It's over." He shook his head. "No," he said, and his gaze drifted past me out to the sea. When he spoke again, his voice was a whisper. "The mist is returning." I looked at the sea. Tendrils of gray were rising up over the water. They were joining and twisting, and within what felt like seconds, the horizon was lost behind a dense mist. As quickly as it had formed, the mist began to roll towards us. I couldn't take my eyes off of it, and I did not move, even though a part of me knew that I should get off the beach and back to my cottage where I would be safe until the mist had passed. Somewhere behind me, I heard pebbles crunching. It was the sound of somebody hurrying along the beach, but I did not turn around. I looked into the mist and felt myself being drawn into it, into the mist's embrace. And then a voice called out, a loud and urgent cry. "Here," it said, "here." It snapped me out of my daze. I span around and saw that it was the old man. He waved me over and I stumbled to his side. I saw that he was holding a lantern now, an old gasoline lamp that he had sparked to life with a cigarette lighter. "What are you doing?" He didn't look at me. He stared into the mist and replied, "Trying to make it right." And then he began to swing the lantern from side to side. Its glow was bright in the mist, which continued to sweep in. It was all around us now, and still he swung the lantern and stared ahead. I felt like he was watching, waiting. But for what? My pulse racing, I looked into the mist and saw a dark shape. It was elusive, and I thought for a moment that I had imagined it. But then I saw the silhouette of a hand, a face. In the darkness and the mist, it was a person, and they were moving towards me, becoming clearer. A coldness spread through my veins and bile rose into the back of my mouth. The thing that I was looking at was not a person, not a living and breathing human being. It was a grotesque apparition. Its eyes were dark hollows in a pale, fleshless skull. Its jaw hung open. Seawater dripped from its ribcage and flowed down the bones of its legs. Its skeletal fingers reached out. Towards me, I thought. I wanted to scream, but fear had stolen my voice. I wanted to run, but I was paralyzed, helpless. And now more nightmares were emerging from the mist. The scraps of clothes hung off the skeletons of some. They all shuffled slowly forwards, being drawn, I now realized, towards the lantern. The old man was shaking, and the lantern rattled in his terrified grip, but he still swung it. What horrors remained out there? I wondered. What else did he want to call forth? My answer came moments later when a new figure came into my view. The mist wrapped itself around its bleached bones, and it drifted through its skeletal remains, and in its arms it carried a body. A jolt of shock passed through me. It was carrying Jane. The thing moved slowly forwards until it was a couple of feet away from the lantern, and then it laid Jane gently down on the beach, as gently as a loving father would do. The old man looked down at Jane. Tears were flowing freely down his face as he said, "Now she has been returned by her kin. The mist is owed a life. Let it have mine." He put the lantern down and walked into the mist. The skeletal forms turned and followed in his wake, until all were lost from sight. The mist holding them retreated then, and I could see more of the beach in front of me, and the edge of the water. Its waves were lapping against the pebbles as the mist continued to fall away, until it was a faint gray haze out over the sea. And then it was gone. The sea was still and blue under a clear sky. I knelt down next to Jane. Her eyes opened and she looked up at me. My heart soared, but it was a happiness that was edged by sadness. Jane was free to live her life once more, but the old man had been taken in her place, and he would become a thing of bone, a creature of the mist.